Now I can say officially good evening. Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. A lot has happened in the Middle East since our last class. And I spoke about it on Friday, but I refused to be happy because I was not sure until I saw these three young ladies in the hands of the Israeli soldiers that it was actually going to happen. And even though I almost never watch Israeli TV or any kind of TV, I did watch, and at one point they put them in a car in Gaza, and the masses, I guess everyone, started to attack the car, and that was a little bit of a scary moment, but they seem to be at least physically in a better shape, I think, that anyone expected. I cannot even start thinking about their mental state. And with that in mind, what happened and the whole thing of October 7th, it's really hard not to think about the material we're discussing in the past several weeks in connection to what happened a year, about 15 months ago. And you'll see in a moment, I got you a little bit of material from one of the British commissions to Israel, and everything they wrote in the 1930s is still valid today, but I'm jumping ahead. Of what? Of this? I have tons of everything. Yeah. It's what is. Here are some important quotes from the Peel Commission report. It's important. We'll look at it. Thank you, Jackie. Let's say that I have one.
It's all separate.
Yeah, just give me one because give me one. I need one. Thank you. Yeah, this is the timeline. I believe that last week, the last thing that we talked about was, I mentioned that next week we'll continue with the Arab revolt. That was the last thing. We talked about the Jaffa riots, about the Hebron massacre, and I said we'll continue with the Arab revolt. I'm referring back to a table that I shared with you last week, which is crucial. Look at the year of 1936. What is the percentage of the Jews in Palestine? 28, between 25 and 30, right? Only 50 years before, it was 5%. And very briefly, I shared with you the book that Malcolm Gladwell just published, his last book. So I think the book that made him famous was The Tipping Point, if you had read it. And he just published several months ago the book by the name of The Revenge of the Tipping Point, which it's quite interesting. And he goes back to some of the theories that he presented in the first book. He revised them a little bit and he adds more things. And one of the ideas in the book is called the magic of third. And what he says in the book is that in order to change a group, you need at least third of the group to be different. And he bases it, I know it's not clear yet, he bases it on a study was done by a Harvard professor who checked boards of big companies. Almost every board has a woman or two. Having few women on the board, it's still a man-dominant culture. And she wanted to know when the shift occurs. When 1/3 of the board are women, it's no longer a male board. It's a real egalitarian board in which gender is not important. When there are less than a third or a quarter, something like that. You have some token women on board. Sounds good. There are some token Jews in some fancy country clubs, but it's not a Jewish culture. It's definitely not a Jewish-loving place. But when you have a third, the culture, you know that the culture has shifted and will shift. Gladwell was not familiar with this table, and until 6 months, I would not have thought about it for a second, but you can look at 1936, in which the Jews in Palestine became a third, or he said between a quarter and a third. And that's when the Palestinian started to feel that Palestine is no longer an Arab state. And it was Arab for almost 2,000 years. They were the majority. They are still the majority if you look at the numbers, but the culture, the face of the place shifted. It's not just a Jewish state, but it's no longer the kind of a state that was before. And going back to Gladwell, another example that he brings is neighborhoods. So a white neighborhood that has some black families, you know, it's nice, diversity, few white families. When you have between quarter and a third black families, that's when the white people started to flee. Because they felt, well, it's no longer the kind of a neighborhood we had. Okay, and we Jews did it a lot, like Harlem was a Jewish place. When about a third of Harlem became black, it's not that people really look at the number. It didn't feel like the place that they were used to. And they fled. Okay, but it's not only the Jews. That's what happens in almost every culture. Now, some people may like it and say, okay, now the culture is better, is more diverse, is more egalitarian, is more... But for many people, wow, this is now a new neighborhood. Okay, and he gives many, many examples about the rule of the third or the magic third. And then I looked at these numbers and said, whoa, it's so true. Because when the Palestinians or the Arab Palestinians felt like a third of their country is Jewish now, here goes the neighborhood. Things are just not right. But something that I don't believe Gladwell said, because again, he did not deal with Zionism, I think that intuitively, not only the Palestinians felt it, but also the Jews. And then they felt like, we're going to make it. We have the critical mass. Then we are going to have a Jewish state. And I'm looking specifically at the year of 1936. What did you say, Bruce?
No, I'll finish what you thought. And then
No, go ahead.
I was just looking at 1947. You said that's a third. And in 1947, there's 1.324 million Arabs. Where did they all end up going in that year?
This is the refugee problem. This is many of them went to Jordan, to other places. Many still live in refugee camps. In Gaza. We weren't fighting. You know, these numbers, there was already shift of populations, but maybe this source is not the most accurate, but definitely after the May of 48, but things started to happen before, and I'll talk about it. There were some massacres of Arabs in Israel. And the fear had already started. Why 1936 is so important? How come that there are so many Jews now in Palestine? Hitler, Europe. Okay, so there was a mass migration of Jews to Palestine. They needed to save themselves. And that's when the Arabs felt that things are getting very bad for them. And things were not good for them. Let's be honest about it. First of all, economically speaking, it was a tough time. Now, even in the rest of the world, remember the Depression time, and things were not good in much more developed countries in the world, let alone in Palestine of the early 30s. The other thing was that the Palestinian Arabs, almost all of them, were peasants. They were farmers. They worked for somebody else. Now the Jews bought the land, and for the most part, kicked them out. Or they told the Arab landlords, before you sell us the land, make sure that all the Arabs who live there are gone. Okay, so when did they move? To cities. They didn't know what to do in cities. They didn't have any profession, so they lived in extreme poverty. In cities, it's not that they were wealthy or anything, but at least they had this little shack on the land, and they had a little land that they cultivated, and things were okay for hundreds and hundreds of years. All of a sudden, things got quite messy. When the violence between Jews and Arab became almost a daily occurrence, the Jews, it started even before, but especially at that time, came up with the idea or the concept of avodah ivrit. What is avodah? Work, labor. What is ivri? Jewish. We hire only Jews. Okay? We hire only Jews now. So even the Arabs who lost their land but now were able to work for Jews, to work on Jewish lands or in other factories that the Jewish people established, all of a sudden, avodah ivrit, no more Arabs. It's not that no Arabs worked at all, but all of a sudden, the Zionists came up with this idea. Okay, so their life of the Arabs deteriorated rapidly. And 1936 is when they decided to take things into their hands. Things happened before. We talked about the Hebron massacre in Jaffa. And there was a guy, oh, actually you should know the name. Have you heard the name Izzadin el-Qassam? In what context? The Qassam rocket. Izzadin el-Qassam is the name of a person, but it's so relevant today because Izzadin el-Qassam is the name of the military wing of Hamas today. Because Hamas has a political wing, because they run Gaza. I don't know what they run today. That's a completely different discussion. I'm not going there. But they had a political, civil part in which they really ran a country of more than 2 million people, and the military. And the military wing was Izzadin el-Qassam. Izzadin el-Qassam was an Arab preacher who was calling for violence against the Jews and against the British. And he was killed by the British just in 1935, but around that time. And riots started, and in 1936, the Arabs started a revolt or a strike. You will find these two terms, the Arab revolt of 1936/39 or the Arab strike. The revolt meant that they started to attack the British and the Jews. The strike was that they boycotted the British and the Jewish economy. We are self-sufficient now. And remember, they were 70% of the population. That was the beginning of the Arab revolt, that a book that was published, I believe last year, only last year, yes, by Kessler, Oren Kessler, an Israeli journalist, by the name of 1936, or something like Palestine, but the big letters 1936. What Kessler argues is that 1936 was the beginning of the major clash between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, and not 1948, as normally we teach. He said that that was the point in which it was very clear to both sides that we're going to fight forever. Either one of us will get rid of the other or we will separate completely. But we are going to have a conflict. That was the watershed point, 1936. For the Arabs, these 3 years were devastating, mainly because they were able to make all the mistakes possible. They attacked the British, killed hundreds of British soldiers and administrators. Of course, they attacked the Jews as well. The British attacked back in a very brutal way, and I even brought some numbers because I wanted to give you the actual, yes. So these are the numbers that I have here. So over 2,000, the estimate that the British killed more than 5,000 Arabs during these 3 years and injured about 15,000. Okay? Several hundred Jews were killed and hundreds of British. The British were extremely, and it's not my opinion, I mean, that was part of the criticism of them even by some other British, they were extremely violent against the Arabs. They hung in 3 years 108 people. Okay, 108. They hung them in 3 years. They killed, I said, about 5,000. Collective punishment was a method. They did not have any tolerance towards them. Okay, more than that, these 3 years, the revolt made the split within the Arab community even worse. There were two major families or clans. We use the word family, but think much more than that. It's a clan in Palestine. One was the Husseinis, and the main person was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. They were very militant against the British and against the Jews. There was another group that was called the Nashashibis, from the Nashashibi family, who believed in a much more peaceful way. And what happened was that the Nashashibis often collaborate with the British. They just did not believe in the violence of the Husseinis. Did I confuse you with all these names? Okay, so it's, again, I just want to make it, there are many big families in the Palestinian world, but the major ones were the Husseinis and the Nashashibis. Nashashibis, for the most part, wanted to be peaceful. The Husseinis, just the opposite, as militant and violent as possible. Okay, so they were not united. They split, and that split just became wider. And as I keep talking, I want you to think, this is 36 to 39, about a decade later, when there is a war now between Israel and the Palestinians, no British. These 3 years of the Arab revolt significantly weakened the Arabs. Physically, because they lost many people, the British hurt their infrastructure. It's very hard, again, not to think about Gaza today. Gaza, if you just look at the pictures of Gaza, it seems like there is no house there that is intact. There is no road, there is no bridge, there is nothing there, right? And that's after 15 months, but this is also modern military. But 3 years of fighting with the British, they lost a lot. Economically, infrastructure, people, and more rivalry between different families, different groups. Bad for the Arabs. On the other hand, it was very good for the Jews. these 3 years, almost because of the opposite reasons. We Jews are rarely united, as we know, but the Arabs were able to unite us. And I will later on talk about the main 3 groups of the Jewish paramilitary group, but there were Jews who were more into peaceful ways and those who were just the opposite and one sort of in the middle. But when you have a common enemy, you get together. You fight together against the common enemy, something that the Arabs were not able to do. Number 2, I want you to learn about a really fascinating man by the name of Ord Wingate. When you travel in Israel, there are many Wingate places because we love Wingate. Wingate was a major general in the British Army. He was a devout Christian and an avid Zionist who believed that the Jews should get Palestine and turn it into a Jewish state. Ord Wingate. Oh, some of you probably remember the Ord that you were working for, one of the Jewish organizations. Does it sound familiar? But that's him. That's this British guy. I read about him. He was crazy, very eccentric. Often, I mean, just because it's interesting, when people came to his house, he didn't wear anything. That was part of his eccentricity. But he was a military genius. I don't have pictures here, don't worry. I don't have pictures, but he was a military genius that did a lot in Japan, in other places during the Second World War. He died in 1944 at a young age. But they brought him to Palestine to help with the Arab revolt. And what Wingate did, which is also important, was to form the Special Night Squads, or SNS. These were elite units that were made of British soldiers and Jewish, not really soldiers, but Jewish paramilitary fighters, if you will. And Wingate trained these groups in his special ways that were extremely violent and brutal, okay? He trained them and weaponized them. This is between 36 to 39. These groups, even after the British left, were the beginning of the famous special units of the IDF. They got their training from the best of the best. Okay, so already in the between 36, 37, not only that there were some paramilitary Jewish groups, they had these commando units, if you will. And he taught them a lot of tactics of how to deal with the Arabs. A lot of night raids, a lot of surprise attacks, etc. And that was very helpful for the Jews. More than that, at least during these 3 years, the Jews were the good ones. Think about the British as this teacher, right? So you have the bad guys who fight all the time, the Jews, the Arabs, the Jews, the Arabs. But during this time, it was very clear. Jews are good, Arabs are bad. Okay, so there was much more sympathy and help toward the Jews. You will read in some places that they also liked the Jews because the Jews looked more like them. Most of the Jews were European. And the world, I don't know now, but definitely back then, tend to look down at Arabs. They were of a lower culture. The Jews were Europeans. They had more a common language with them, okay? And to remind you, the 1917 Balfour Declaration, in which the British promised a Jewish land in Palestine for the Jews, okay? So the Jews gained quite a lot from that. They knew how to play it smartly. And they did something else. I want to show you a little video. It's a little video. It has sound, right? So it's only 3 minutes.
During these days of anguish for the Jewish people, the Jews of Palestine displayed surprising vitality. Every 2 to 3 weeks, a convoy of trucks laden with prefabricated houses would make its way to one of the country's desolate regions. The objective? To complete construction of a new village within one day. The settlers knew that their activities were under close observation and also realized that the Arab bands would never attack during daylight hours. The task was therefore to complete construction of the stone-filled wooden stockade wall and the watchtower before nightfall. These events, repeated all over the country, gave the period its name, Tower and Stockade. The Tower and Stockade pioneers firmly believed that their activities were no less important than decisions taken at 10 Downing Street. And so, during the very days when Mr. Chamberlain had determined to put an end to the ideal of a Jewish state, this state was already in the process of formation through the creation of facts.
Okay, I know it's a little confusing, but you saw it, it's fascinating. Okay, if last week I asked you to try to look at it from the perspective of the Arabs, this week I do it definitely from the perspective of the Jews. The British, as we will see in length, restricted Jewish migration to Palestine. They also restricted Jewish purchase of land because the Arabs were complaining that the Jews buy all the Arab land, so you cannot. And they didn't allow or made it hard for Jews to build new communities, new towns. And here is the genius of the Jews. You've been here for many, many weeks now. You know that I'm not saying it easily, and not everything that Israel did or does or will do is genius, but this one was. There was a law still in the books from the Ottoman Empire that states that if a place is built in one day and has a roof, it cannot be demolished. Okay? That was the law, and the British who came to Palestine did not change all the laws, and that was the law. What they did, do you see this map? Every little black dot there, they created a Jewish settlement. And they did it, as you saw in the movie, in the most ingenious and beautiful way. They had prefabricated walls, prefabricated tower, and some other materials. And every 2 weeks or so, they went somewhere, and during one day, first erected the wall around, then put up the tower, because that's the way to guard it, because the Arabs would attack them. The British would tell them, you cannot just build whatever you want, okay? And they put few little buildings. Now look where they did it. Look at these black dots. What they were doing, starting in 1936, was creating the borders of future Israel. You can see along the Mediterranean and along the border, the Jordan, the Sea of Galilee. Okay, this is more or less the future map of Israel. They just put these towns, they were small. They were really small. Each one of them was built on about 1/4 of an acre. But it was enough, because around that they have the fields that they cultivated, that they worked in. There were guards on the towers to protect them, sometimes more successfully than others. And in few years, they were able to build, I believe, 57 of these communities. The majority, like 52 of them, were kibbutzim. Okay? But just think about what it takes. First of all, they were all volunteers. So you need the volunteers to build the prefabricated walls and towers, and then you need a group to come and with 1 day to finish building a little town. They called it a little town. Okay? It's amazing. So while the Arabs were fighting with the British, and here and there killing few Jews, the Jews, they were defending themselves, but they were building. Remember the magic of the third. They felt, well, we pass this tipping point and we can make it. So they did not think about yesterday, they were thinking about the future, which is, I find it fascinating. Any comments or questions about, yes?
So was there a Jewish group or organization masterminding or organizing that?
Yes. Yes, so Audrey asked if there was a Jewish sort of government that masterminded the whole thing. Yes. There was the Yeshuv, that's the name of the pre-Israel Jewish community. It's called Yeshuv, and the Yeshuv had its leadership. The leader of the Yeshuv and later on of the State of Israel was Ben Gurion, David Ben Gurion. Okay, a person who should get so much more credit than he ever got. So he was the mastermind behind it. I mean, for this project, I can give you a name because he was the second prime minister of Israel. It was Moshe Sharet, or Shartok. Most of the not most, I think all of the Israeli leaders at that time had to change their name from their traditional Jewish, Polish, Russian name to a Hebrew name. So Ben Gurion was green. Sharet was Shartok. Okay, they all had a regular name, Jewish name like we have, but they turned them into something that's like Hebrew name. They didn't want anything to do with the past, with the exile, the diaspora. Okay, so they all changed their names. So Ben Gurion was the head of it, and they had serious institutions. Even the constructions of the walls and the towers and the houses was done by the construction company that was led by the Yeshuv. It's called Solel Uboneh, if you care about the name. That's what they did, okay? So yeah, there was almost a functioning government, and that's another part of Kessler's argument in his book, Palestine 1936, is that the Jews started to build the infrastructure, political. So I mentioned the military one first, right? They had their paramilitary, which maybe I should talk more about it now. And then they had the political one. And they had very smart, dedicated people. And they were pretty much unified. It's not that they didn't have separate groups, okay? But they all had one vision. It was very clear that the first enemies were the Arabs and the British. And you don't fight fellow Jew. There were a few little murders here and there, but it was almost non-existent, because especially when we compare to the Arabs, for whom it was the routine. The different large Arab clans constantly fought with each other. If they didn't do it, there wouldn't be Israel today. There is no way, okay? But they wasted so much energy and resources on infights and fighting against the British and not really building for the future. And the Jews did it. Without knowing Malcolm's book, I think when they sense we have a third, we're going to make it. Thank you for this question, because it was a great segue to what I was about to talk about, the political institutions and social institutions as well, absolutely. So the British didn't know what to do with the Arab revolt, and they brought a commission to Israel. It's called, the head of the commission was Lord Peel, and they came to investigate what was happening. They met with everyone, with all the Jews, with the British. They even crossed the border to Transjordan and met with King Abdullah. They had, however, a vast majority of the Arabs refused to talk to them. And why is that? Because if they talk to the British, they recognize the British, and they indirectly recognize the idea of a Jewish state or Jews in Palestine. So instead of trying to get as much as they can from the British, they boycott. So they did have enough Arabs to talk to, but not the main leadership of the Arabs. A mistake they will make again several years later. Okay? And I copied a few quotes from the Peel Committee. Okay, so they came and needed to present their recommendations to the British government. Let me just read a few of them. Take it with you. An irrepressible conflict has risen between two national communities within the narrow bounds of one small country. There is no common ground between them. Their national aspirations are incompatible. Why is it so important? Because that was the first time that the British started to think, maybe one state by the name of Palestine is not a vital solution for that land. Until 1936, they envisioned ultimately Palestine with an Arab group and a Jewish group. We talked several weeks ago about many of the countries that they created with different minority groups, right? The Alawis control the Syria, and the Hashemites control Jordan, even though they're a tiny minority, and Lebanon is a mess, was a mess, is a mess. So in their mind, that's exactly what's going to happen in Palestine. So there will be a Palestine, majority of Arabs, minority of Jews, and let them deal with it, okay? or they will learn to deal with it. But here the Peel Committee is saying, no, there is irrepressible conflict. The second one, the Arabs desire to revive the traditions of the Arab Golden Age, which was never really golden in Palestine. They had golden ages. Never underestimate the Arabs. They invented math. I mean, some of them were super smart. They just, but not in Palestine. The Jews desire to show what they can achieve when restored to their land in which the Jewish nation was born. Neither of two nations' ideals permits of combination in the service of a single state. They say it explicitly. They said it in 1936. These two peoples cannot share a country. It's not going to work. Much of the land now carrying orange groves that was sand dunes or swamp and uncultivated when it was purchased. What are they saying here? The Jews were serious. They bought all this uncultivated land. Most of the land was swamp. Nobody grew anything there, and they found ways to do it. They learned how to do it, and they brought capital from Europe. Many good Jews invested. So there was just land that nobody wanted, and all of a sudden there are orange groves there. There used to be many, it all turned into real estate, but that's a different story. The shortage of land is, we consider, due less to the amount of land acquired by Jews than to increase in Arab populations. They had a lot of babies, okay? They needed more land. They did, I'm not sure how accurate it was, but yes, I mean, it was accurate about the very large Arab families. The Jewish national home is no longer an experiment. This is good. Okay? It's no longer an experiment. The growth of its population has been accompanied by political and military and social services, etc. This is not just, some sporadic groups of Jews who came. This is it. This is real. They're serious about it. Half of the Arab populations are landless. They live in villages or on the outskirts of towns and obtain their livelihood by some form of labor. The wages are low and most of them are constantly in debt. That's true. That's the reality. The life of Arabs since the Jews started to arrive deteriorated significantly. Very few of them, mainly the landlords, those who sold the land to the Jews, benefited from the Jewish migration to Israel, or to Palestine back then. It was believed that with the continued development of the Jewish national home and with the further growth of Arab political consciousness, a serious clash was inevitable. And 48 was a huge clash, and the Arabs have been in contact with the Jews in Palestine for centuries, and they have found them an unsympathetic and arrogant people who look down upon them. They interviewed all of them, and that was the feeling of the Arabs. These Jews never respected us. Let me tell you something else. No European respected us too, them too. They used them when they could, but they did not respect them. Okay? I don't know, again, how accurate it is, but that was the impression of the Peel Committee. At that time, the Arab Higher Committee, which was their government, or at least led by the Husseinis, the more militant group, boycotted the commission on the grounds that its terms of reference presuppose the validity of the Balfour Declaration and the mandate. I mentioned it. And look at the very last line. The Commission recommended the partition of Palestine into three parts: a Jewish state, a territory under British administration, and an area to be annexed to Transjordan. Let me show you the map that makes everything clear. You see this orangey color? Arab state. You see the green? Jewish state. You see this little red? British. Okay, so they will have Jerusalem, and they wanted a corridor to the sea, and that was their suggestion. What do you think? Yeah, who got the majority? The Arabs. At that point, there were about 2/3, and they got much more, and they didn't get the good. Back then, today we look at real estate differently. Back then, it was the fertile land that was important. So the green here, I don't know, it's probably not a coincidence, is very green. This is the Jezreel Valley. This is a very fertile land. That's where the agriculture of Israel is still focused today. Since then, they learned even how to do things in the desert, but back then, okay? So the Arabs said, can you guess? No way. The Jews said, probably no way. But they were open to some discussions, okay? They hated it, the Jews, because they envisioned a Jewish state in Palestine, okay? And ultimately, the British government rejected the Peel Committee recommendation, but it's crucially important because that was the first time ever that someone was talking about a partition of splitting of the land between the Arabs and the Jews, being very honest. That's why I wanted you to see the actual quote. These guys are not going to live together. It's not going to work. We're lying to ourselves if we think that it's going to work. So if they cannot live together, let's split. And they even included some ideas of a land swap and even population swap, just to make it a little bit more livable for both sides. But the Arabs didn't even want to hear about it, and not much happened as a result of the Peel Committee. Only this idea, it was a very important seed that was planted in some heads. But something bad, I said that the Jews gained a lot from the Arab revolt. The Arab lost a lot. But the British, towards the end of it, did something very bad for the Jews. And I'm going now, if you have your timelines, to 1939, the White Paper. There were two previous white papers that I did not include in the material. They were not really important. White paper is a group of British diplomats and some experts come and do the research and write a report. But the 39 one was bad. And why is that? Because the British decided that they were going to please everyone. And at that point, despite the fight with the Arabs, they needed the Arabs. Why did they need the Arabs in 1939? A war was about to start. So it's not just the Arabs in Palestine. That's nothing. They needed the support of all the Arab countries against the Germans. Okay? So all of a sudden, the value of the Arabs went up significantly because, you don't want to upset Arab countries and Arab populations in other parts of the world over this not very important area, Palestine. Okay? So what they did was to significantly restrict the number of Jewish immigration to Palestine. And listen to the number. 75,000 people in 5 years. Where were the Jews starting in 39? They were massacred. You want me to make it even worse? They issued only 46,000 permits, even though officially They said that there will be 75,000. They didn't even use up all 75. So our Jews were burning in the concentration camps. They just closed the border. And that's something that we can never recover from. Okay? We could have saved millions, probably, at least hundreds of thousands of Jews. It's not so far geographically. I know we can say the same about America, but America is not a Jewish state. And all the Jews loved Roosevelt back then, and nobody would dare to say anything bad about it. But, you know, America can do what America, but this is our place. You promised us, British, that Palestine will be a Jewish place, and now when we're massacred, you just don't allow us to get there. And they did it because they needed to please the Arabs. And here's the real tragedy. It didn't work. The Arabs hated them even more. Because for the Arabs, it was not less is good. We don't want any Jews. We want you to annul the Balfour Declaration completely. We want you to forget about any idea of a Jewish state. We want you to block completely any immigration of even half a Jew to Palestine. So what they thought was a compromise that will sort of please or equally upset both sides, but at least both sides will live with it. The Arabs were not appeased at all. They were as angry as before. And that's why Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Arabs, the Mufti of Jerusalem, went to Germany and has a million pictures with Adolf Hitler because he became the enemy, because Germany was the enemy of his enemy, right? So if the British were enemies of the Palestinians, Hitler was his buddy, okay? So they hurt the Jews so significantly, and this week, it's easy to see how, right? It's not that they killed us, but just not to allow these poor Jews who needed a place to run away to get there and got nothing in return from the Arabs. Okay? And this is the white paper of 1939. This huge restriction of Jewish immigration, restriction of permits for Jewish acquisition or purchase of land in Palestine when we desperately needed it to survive. Ben-Gurion said something really smart at that time. He said, we have no choice now because the British are not nice to us. At the same time, they're fighting our biggest enemy, which is Germany. So he said, and I should have written the exact quote, but something along the lines is, we are fighting Hitler like there is no white paper, and we are fighting the white paper like there is no Hitler. Because there were, the Jewish yeshuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, did whatever they could to fight the Germans. Okay, just think how complicated everything is. So the British who give you a hard time, don't allow Jews to immigrate, but at the same time they fight, and we know how the British fought the German. They fight your worst enemy. It's so confusing. You don't know who is the bad guy, who is the worst guy. Okay? So this is the 1939 white paper. And that started a new chapter in the relationship of the Jews against the British. The Jewish paramilitary groups started to attack some British officers and British infrastructure. There were 3 Jewish paramilitary groups. The large one, the most important one, the one that will become the IDF in May, probably 14 or 15, 1948, is the Haganah. Okay, so that was the Jewish army of the time of, let's call it, the Haganah was founded in 1920, but really they started to function the way they should in 1936. First, to defend the Jewish communities from the Arabs during the Arab Revolt. And then I described to you what Ord Wingate did by establishing this Jewish commander unit and really taught them how to fight and how to become an army. Okay, so this is the Haganah. Another group that was much more militant than the Haganah was the Etzel. Okay, or the Irgun, as it's known here in this country. Etzel is an acronym, and the first word of Etzel is Irgun Tzvai Leumi, a national military organization. Irgun is organization, okay? Like you all know about the Mossad, right? Mossad simply means institution. There is nothing, okay? So just institution. There are millions Mossads in Israel, just like here. There are million institutions. Okay, so that's the Irgun, much more militant than the Haganah, believed in attacking more the British and of course the Arabs, and they killed more British soldiers and British important sites. And the most super duper militant was the Stern Gang, as they're known here. In Hebrew, they're known as Lechi, okay? They just started to, they wanted to kill everyone. You know, it's important to remember because the most decorated soldier in the history of Israel, the most decorated general, the most genius, who even was a prime minister for a few years, his name was Ehud Barak, said, you know, we were terrorists back then because we had a goal and we realized that only with power, only with violence, we're going to get rid of the British. So he said, in one way, I have sympathy to the Palestinian terrorists because that's what we did. Of course, he's not pro-Palestinian, don't take it. But he, in a moment of real honesty, said, that's what we did. Let me just show you one picture of what they did. Have you been to Jerusalem? This is the King David Hotel. Okay? They bombed it and killed 91 people, mostly civilians. Okay? So yeah, they didn't mean to, and communication and the whole thing, but this is a famous incident. Okay? Yeah, they just wanted to kick the British out, and they thought that by putting pressure on the British, they will say to themselves, you know, this Palestine is the biggest headache we have. We have so many other challenges around the world. Let's get out of there. And guess what? 1947, the British went to the UN and said, it's yours. Our mandate is over. We don't want to be there. We're out. And they gave a date. May 14th, 1948, we're out. We don't care what happens. Okay? Many people believe that it was this, I know it's not nice to use the word terrorist, but in this class I try to be as honest as possible. You can call it freedom fighters if you want, but no matter what you want, this is violence. Of course, they didn't kill women and children on purpose, but they did, you know, they did what they thought was the right thing to do, while all the time dealing with the British and the world in diplomatic ways. Okay, so these three groups are important to know, and since 1940 or so, their targets became also the British. We want you out. And the reason that they could afford getting rid of the British was that they believed that they had what was needed to run a country. And they did. And they did. Okay? So I'm going to sum up the class today. 1936 to 1939, it's an event that very few people even know about. It's not something that people talk about, right? But it was probably the most crucial event during that time, during the British Mandate of Palestine. The Arab revolt against the British and against the Jews, but mostly against the British, something that weakened the Arabs dramatically, fractured them, and did the opposite to the Jews. Helped them to start building de facto state with political infrastructure, social, and a more and more effective military one. And that's why in 1948, it was not easy, but they were ready. But few things happened before, but what my plan is for next week is to finish that and to declare the state of finally to get to the establishment of the State of Israel. And then I want to take a month off of Jewish history. I just want to teach something else. You're all welcome, we'll do it the same place, same time. I need a break. No, really, I love that, and it's super important. And I never had so many people who followed and came week after week, but I think that for all of our benefit, we can take a break. So we'll end more or less in 1948, 49 with the beginning of the State of Israel. And I want to do something completely different, Jewish. I want to explore together the most important, which is, of course, the most subjective thing I can say, Jewish stories ever told. Really some different kind of Torah study. Not history this time so much, even though it's hard not to include history in whatever we do, just to take a month off something else. I hope that you will choose to come and enjoy that, but it will be much lighter. Because this class, I feel each time when it's over, no, I feel like I relive it. And now when we get closer to the Holocaust and you keep thinking about what if the British just would allow us? What if the Americans would open the border? What if? Okay, and then you look at the news today and see how relevant things are. Okay, just remember, for the Arabs, the Jews were the immigrants that they wanted to kick out of their country. Okay, we were the immigrants that everyone hated. So I relive the times and the present. So next week will be a really good one because we will finish the British Mandate. We will celebrate the foundation of the State of Israel. We'll tell some of the secrets of what happened to the Arabs, okay? And then I'll say a few other things because my promise to you during the high holidays, and that's how it all started, was you will have enough information when people tell you, no, Israel is not a legitimate place, the Jews do not belong there, the whole thing. I think having the history will try to come up with some good answers. No, we belong there. And no, we're not just a simple colonial group that took over a land, etc. That's what I hope to achieve next week. Thank you. And see you next week.